Hi everyone, it's Christina. I am doing my second blog post, and we've been asked to discuss the different types of course objectives and pick one that is kind of specific to what we do. And so I've chosen the objective about justifying the selection of appropriate AAC communication systems to support communication and learning with individuals with ASD and related disorders, because that's really kind of the bread and butter of what I do in my classroom. My OGE preschool classroom is basically a classroom where we are concentrating on communication more than anything else. We talk about the students' IEP goals and objectives. That's what we work on, but the most important part of our class is that we're language-based, and that is usually when I ask the parents what do they want their child to get out of the class by the end of the year. It's being able to communicate in some form, because most of my students are nonverbal or very limited verbally. And when we talk about one-to-one devices, the only ones that I use in my classroom with one-to-one devices are communication-based devices. So I have one student right now that has a Dynavox. And then the other students, I kind of have to look at where they are and what their skills are and figure out the best type of communication device or technology to use to help them communicate. For the most part, we always start with signs and visuals, because my students are completely on opposite ends of the spectrum, so to speak, with their communication. So I have some students that are so incredibly low and needy that we're working on such basic things like signing more or pointing even, where I have other students that are more verbal and we use visuals to kind of help support their language, but we're really working on that verbal language, and I have it all kind of in between. One of the biggest challenges that I've had, I have to say, in this classroom is there's different thoughts about what these students should be doing. So I take classes, trainings on ABA, and ABA is all about verbal behavior, and there's visual supports, but mainly just working on trying to get these kids to talk, which is good and helpful, but some of these kids just kind of aren't doing it yet. And then I went to another training for a grant for the core communication boards, which was interesting because I was doing that and the ABA training at the same time and hearing completely different sides, you know. So when I was talking to the ABA trainings and trying to figure out the best way to integrate the core boards, I was told that they don't really use them in that training, but it works for my students, for some of my students, and so I'm going to use it. And this is kind of an example of what I'm doing. If you can see this, this is a 50-word core board, and basically the point of core vocabulary boards is just saying that most of our language is made up of core vocabulary, and things like verbs and nouns and adjectives are really more of fringe vocabulary. So if you think about a sentence, when you say, I am going to the store, most of your words in there are core. I go to, you know, and store is the noun. But you could, if you just said store, what would it mean? Whereas if you said I go to, at least you kind of understand what's saying there. So using this, I'm trying to figure out the best way. Like some students, we use these boards. Some students, I just use some words from these boards. And I use different voice output devices in my classes, from a simple Big Mac, you know, just one button. I have 3-cell buttons, I have 2-cell buttons, and I have multi-cell buttons, all 6, 8, 20 that you can use with that. I think that the biggest challenge with this is knowing exactly what you need to use for each student, figuring out where they are and what they benefit from, and then if they're making growth, what's next? Juggling all of it, because I have 10 students in my class right now. Some students that were literally, the only thing that they were working on with these guys is at snack time with a 2-cell, an open and a more, just trying to get them to understand, because that's the most motivating time. and then other students that are more verbal and we're just using it to help expand their language. So just knowing the best way to use it and best way to expand on it. And then on top of it, then training my staff the best way to use it and the best way to expand upon it and to use it in a way that's meaningful and relevant for these kids. I think that's the biggest challenge, and I think that kind of is the biggest challenge for any kind of technology that you're using in a classroom, is to make sure that you're using it in a way that's relevant and meaningful and appropriate for that student's needs, and then making sure everybody's on the same page about it, and then making sure that you have that growth that needs to be implemented. So it's also, time consuming, when you look at it. Like, it's not, you think using something like this isn't that time consuming, which is not. You just have to print them and copy it. But then if you think about wanting to use other types of visuals for communication supports, because there are other things in the classroom and things that you want your students to be able to request, so you have to make it. And so if you're using a multi-cell device, you have to make overlays for that. And then if you want to include the different story vocabulary, every story, every center, every activity that you're working with the kids, and if you want visuals, you have to make them. And then you have to make sure your adults are using them appropriately. So I think that that's kind of like a challenge with any kind of technology, be it low tech to high tech, is to make sure that it's correct and it's right, and that the students are using it in a way that's appropriate and in a way that meets their needs, and that the adults are using it in a way that's appropriate and a way that meets their needs. And then knowing exactly where the students' needs are and where you're going to go from there. So I think that that particular objective is probably the most stressed objective in my classroom, in my OGE3's classroom. And I have to say that so far with this class, it's really kind of helped me think about it and think about the different kinds of technology and think about how I'm thinking about technology, because I'm not going to lie, sometimes I'm kind of closed-minded about it. I'm very low-tech when it comes to my preschool classroom. I feel like a lot of times my little guys, when they leave me, most of their world is involved in that kind of technology, that iPad, that phone, that is like kind of their world most of the time. And I want my classroom to not be that way. I want my classroom to be let's do toys, let's do pictures, let's do objects. So I have to admit, I'm kind of an old lady when it comes to some of this technology thoughts. So it's good this class is kind of opening it up and making sure that I'm thinking about it in a way that I can make my teaching more meaningful for my students and more inclusive for all of my students. So that is, I don't want to run over my time. I think I've gabbed on enough, and I look forward to any feedback that anybody might have or any questions anybody might have. Thanks so much. Have a great day.